Please welcome Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes and the Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Ben, I've always wanted to get you on the couch, actually. So if you want to lie down,
I was
we
thinking
could
about
really
it.
psychoanalyze
I got some
Obama's
things to
foreign
work out,
policy
yeah.
instead of just analyze it.
Instead of everybody else doing it.
Right, exactly. Thank you for doing this. And I would love to get up to 30,000 feet as quickly as possible, but we have to talk about the news of the morning and the previous week. Russia is apparently now engaged in airstrikes against what it says are ISIS targets. In the last week, we've seen Russia form an alliance with our putative ally Iraq, our putative adversary Iran, our target Syria. There's a feeling, certainly in Republican circles and in a lot of foreign policy elite circles in Washington, that Putin is the activist in the Middle East, that your boss is withdrawing us as quickly as he can with possibly dire consequences. Tell us the thinking in the White House right now about what you're doing, and more to the point, what you're not doing.
Well, first of all, with respect to what Russia's doing, they're not forming anything new in terms of an alliance. They had a decades-long relationship with the government of Syria. They've had a long-standing relationship with the government of Iran. Those are their partners in the region. The fact of the matter is, it's their former client, Assad, who's been seeing his state authority collapse around him for years, and Russia's been supporting him. So what we're really seeing is an escalation of what Russia was already doing in providing military support to Assad. We've said, and the President met with President Putin, that the notion that Russia would want constructive. And the main determining factor for Russia is if they understand that parallel to any counterterrorism efforts, there has to be a political resolution to the conflict in Syria. Otherwise, the fighting's not going to stop. You cannot make the two-thirds of that country who are Sunni, who are never going to accept the legitimacy of Bashar al-Assad, whether they're ISIL or not, accept an outcome in which he's still the leader of the country. Which leads quickly to the second part of your question, which is, I think what President Obama has been very deliberate about in the Middle East is we will have to protect our core interests. That means denying terrorist safe haven. That means protecting our allies and partners. But we have to recognize that there are not military solutions, and certainly not U.S.-imposed military solutions, or for that matter, Russia-imposed military solutions on these problems.
Isn't one American core interest in the Middle East not allowing Russia to build bases on NATO's southern flank, which is what it's doing in Syria right now?
But again, they had a base in Syria. This is not new. I mean, one way to think about this is, everybody's looking at Putin as if this is some offensive maneuver. Again, they've had bases in Syria for a very long time. This is their principal client state in the Arab world. It's been collapsing. He's trying to prop it up. I think that's hardly someone who's in a strong position. That's, by the way, the same thing he's facing in Ukraine. They had a client in Yanukovych. That collapsed out of the hollow rot of corruption. Now they're trying to grab a piece of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian people are rejecting them. So this is not someone who's operating from a position of strength. This is someone who is seeing, again, two of his principal partners in the world in a lot of trouble. Ukraine already shifted.
Why is it being interpreted as we're on the back foot a little bit, rather than Russia and this alliance that it's built?
Well, again, I'd rather be us than Russia. Our economy is growing. We are expanding our footprint in the world and reaching into places like Asia and Africa and the Americas in new ways. Russia's economy is contracting. It's hollowing out in many ways. I think the reason why is that for too long, the way in which foreign policy issues are viewed in this city, frankly, is, number one, you show strength through shows of military force. And if we're not somehow filling certain vacuums with American military power, then we're not serious. But the fact of the matter is, not only do we think that in Syria,
but you would like Russia to win against ISIS.
We'd like the world to win against ISIL. Who wouldn't? And the fact of the matter is, the United States also has a very broad set of interests. Everybody focuses like a laser on the Middle East, and we spend a lot of time, more time on the Middle East than any other region. But we cannot continue to be in a cycle where all of our resource allocation, all of our attention is trying to fix fundamentally broken societies in the Middle East, when you have a big world out there where we have enormous interests. The Asia-Pacific is the largest emerging market in the world. That's going to matter a lot more to the American people in the 21st century than the Middle East is. Now, we have grave threats emanating from the Middle East that have to be dealt with, so I don't want to minimize that. But again, I think there's a certain mentality that sees every problem as in the Middle East, every problem is a nail, and we only have a hammer. And the fact of the matter is, yes, the military has to be a part of it.
But do you think we're paying a price for inaction going back to the beginning of the Syrian civil war? 2011, 2012, when we didn't engage, when there was no, well, ISIS wasn't what it is today, obviously. The predecessor groups of ISIS weren't what they were.
Well, again, the question is, what are the options available? And the fact of the matter is, every time the president looked at this, and we've looked at this repeatedly, we did not see a viable military option that could resolve the situation in Syria. And so, yes, you could have taken action earlier, but that doesn't mean that you wouldn't have the same fundamental conflicts inside of Syria, where you have essentially a sectarian war taking place. You have an all-white minority, you have a Sunni majority, you've got other minority populations who are very concerned about their position, you've got external actors who are arming proxies in the country, and the notion that airstrikes or support to one opposition group was going to eliminate those factors, I don't think is borne out by the reality of the Middle East. The fact is, what we've always stressed to all of our partners, and including inside of Syria, is there has to be political accommodation. And without that political accommodation inside the country, there's not going to be stability.
But you would rather, at this point, see Assad stay in power than have ISIS march into Damascus?
No, well, look, we obviously think that ISIL marching in Damascus.
Can we even agree what we call the group? We can't even do that, right? We're never gonna do that.
We can call it Daesh.
Daesh.
How about that?
Yeah,
Everybody's
Daesh
more comfortable with that. It's common ground. Look, the point we've made on Assad is he is the initiator of this conflict. He's the one who started dropping barrel bombs and brutalizing his people.
With a lot of help from his sponsor, Iran.
Well, Hezbollah, via Hezbollah in particular, and Iran, of course, as a principal sponsor of Hezbollah. And the fact of the matter is, whether or not, it's not just a matter of, we object to him because of our values, which we certainly do. It's the fact that, just from a realist perspective, how are you going to restore stability with the guy who has lost control of his country because his people rejected him? ISIL has benefited from his actions. One very interesting thing, by the way, is Assad has not really gone after ISIL. He's preferred to just brutalize the broader Sunni population and go after some of the other opposition groups.
No, it's in his best interest to have radical Islamist.
And the fact is, this kind of nihilism that we see in parts of Syria, clearly Assad's actions have been a magnet for foreign fighters, for the jihadists, violent jihadists from across the region to come there. And so, our message is, look, there's no outcome that is truly stable if he's still in charge of the country. Now, we've said that can be a managed process. That we'll have to negotiate something. It would have to be implemented over a period of time. But the outcome of that process would have to be different leadership.
I have two quick Putin questions. The first is, how important does President Obama think Putin is in the world? And second is, how much does President Obama not like Putin? Like, if there's a scale, like there's the French president and Netanyahu and Putin, where do they, what's on the, the Pope?
Yeah.
The Pope to Putin, where do they fall in this kind of spectrum?
I don't think there's any way I can answer that.
I think you should try.
The totality of that
Make
question
believe they're not here for a minute.
Can we put the Pope at the top?
Pope,
yes.
Extremely controversial statement.
Yeah. So, look, in terms of their personal relationship, he is what you see, and when they sit down together, they talk on the phone. It's not like they're getting into arguments. They're disagreeing with one another, and they're having very straightforward conversations about how they differ. In terms of his role in the world, look, when Russia...
And I ask that, by the way, because Obama is in many ways the first Cold War president, and so I'm curious to how he views Russia as a threat.
Well, so I think when Russia works with us on international problems, it's easier to resolve them. So, for instance, Russia worked with us on the Iran deal. They were basically in lockstep with us throughout those negotiations, except for one or two issues. That was enormously helpful in accomplishing what we believe is a very successful deal that prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. On Syria, Russia has not worked with us, and it's been more difficult to resolve that challenge because of the influence that they have over Assad, who's been their longstanding client in many ways. So I think the way the president views this is, if Russia, and this is what his speech was about, the more Russia invests itself in essentially an international system that works and that can resolve problems, the easier it is for us to advance our interest, particularly in particular areas where we overlap with the Russians. In terms of the threat that they pose, look, there's no risk. Like I said, this is not a country that is resurgent, that's going to take over vast spheres of influence. The places that they're operating are the places where, the notion that Russia is having to try to assert itself in eastern Ukraine, having completely lost the hearts and minds of the people and the rest of the country who want to orient to Europe, again, is not an offensive maneuver in the strategic context. What it is it's a violation of international law. And the threat that the president sees is that Putin, in pushing these boundaries, is undermining the rules that govern the international system. So if he gets away with that in Ukraine without paying a price, other people look at that and they think, I could do that too. And the basis of a lot of what we're doing in Ukraine, the sanctions we're imposing that are having a significant impact on them, is, number one, obviously, to help resolve the situations of the Ukrainian people can determine their own future. But two is just to buttress the international system and not let those types of actions go without consequences. But one thing that I was struck by, Jeff, last week, just mass focus on Putin, which I completely understand, given what he's doing. But President Xi Jinping came to Washington too. I think China is going to play a more significant role in the 21st century, and sometimes that's lost. Russia and the Middle East are kind of the touchstones of our foreign policy for so many years. That's often where the attention is. We think that that's incredibly important, but we also think there's a big world out there.
I would love to keep pressing you on this, but we're limited in time, and you've sort of given me a way to transit to a broader question. We're coming to the end of the Obama presidency. We're beginning to see patterns in what you might call an Obama doctrine, or Obama doctrines. Obviously, to your critics, Obama doctrine is about the aversion to the use of force, withdrawal from the Middle East, things like that. From your perspective, and I ask you as the sort of the leader inside the White House of the opening to Cuba, talk about, if you can, just for a minute, sort of the White House approach to this idea that you take, one of the goals of this administration has been to take adversaries and neutralize them as adversaries. If you had to name the Obama doctrine, would that be it, or is there something else that you also want to sort of?
Well, again, what I think, if you were to look at the totality of what we're doing, it's about positioning the United States to be a leader going forward in the 21st century. That may sound trite. To fill that in, though, what that means is, number one, that we're rebuilding the strength of our own foundation, our economy. And number two, that we're extricating ourselves from the enormous allocations of resources that we had when we took office in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we had 150,000 troops, we're spending $1 trillion, so that we're husbanding the resources that are going to be necessary for the United States to succeed. Number three, that we are using diplomacy to neutralize potential conflicts. With Iran, we successfully prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon and avoid a potential very costly war in the Middle East.
It's a huge risk, though, to try to extricate yourself from the Middle East, no? Because, one could argue that we left Iraq too early and bad actors filled the void. Is the president learned that you can't get out, as it's the Corleone rule, that you can't leave no matter what you try to do?
Well, one could argue that, going into Iraq and invading that country and eliminating the apparatus of the state and created the initial vacuum that we're still dealing with. And I think,
But that already happened. That's why every president inherits a
but
bad pile
that is
of
a
stuff.
far, well, this was a particularly big pile, but the point I make here is that there's an agency assigned to the United States in these matters that we have to be realistic about. 10,000 troops in Iraq, which is what the potential option was on the table, with no legal protections because the Iraqi government wasn't going to support it. The notion that that would have made all these people in Iraq get along and not have sectarian conflicts and not have ISIL emerge out of the ashes of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which it basically is the same organization. What would those 10,000 of troops, how would they have made the Iraqi people resolve their differences? How would they have made Nouri al-Maliki not govern as a sectarian leader? How would those 10,000 troops have made Bashar al-Assad not brutalize his people and create a vacuum in eastern Syria for ISIL? It's just such a simplistic notion that if we have a certain number of troops somewhere, somehow those places are going to be stable. That's just not the nature of the lessons that we take away from the last decade. So the fact of the matter is, it's not about extricating. We're going to have interest. We're going to have to deny terrorist safe haven. We're going to have to figure out how to train better partners, frankly, to do that on the ground with us. But again, if all the United States is doing in our foreign policy is perpetually, the Obama doctrine to our detractors is often whatever the worst place is in the world that day is our foreign policy, and we did it, even, not Bashar al-Assad. It's somehow our agency. The fact of the matter is it's a very, very difficult and complicated world right now, and we are managing very difficult challenges in the Middle East. And by the way, I think it's going to be that way for a long time in the Middle East because the structures there don't make sense to the modern world in a lot of states, and we cannot allow that to deter us from the fourth point I was going to make, which is we need to refocus on other areas of the world as well. The Asia-Pacific, where we have enormous interests, economic interests that dwarf anything in the Middle East. Latin America and Africa, these are emerging regions. This is where the front lines of democracy are, where we're trying to consolidate democratic progress. These are potential very significant markets.
So in short, has the president decided that all you can do in the Middle East is disaster mitigation, and Asia is where the positive opportunities lie for America in the future? Well,
I think that we certainly have to mitigate threats in the Middle East. We have affirmative interests there. We have partners there that we'd like to see stronger, Israel first and foremost. We would like to see a resolution to the underlying conflicts that are taking place in the Middle East, which are sectarian and political as much as they are rooted in terrorist activity. But I do think that there's a certain component of American policy that is going to have to be mitigation. We tried the affirmative project of building a democracy there. The fact of the matter is we cannot determine for people by force what their societies or how their societies are going to be organized. We can provide incentives and disincentives for people to pursue models in which there's a political accommodation and stability. And unless we realize that, we're going to find ourselves, I think, repeating a lot of errors that will be very costly.
Ben, thank you very much for doing this. Appreciate it. Thank you.